typically higher education levels than the average person. This doesn't mean we're smarter. This doesn't mean anything in that sense. What it means is we have a different perspective to our users. Our households are also different. Jessica and Sarah are both reasonably likely to be mothers based on their average household size, but have less disposable income. And this influences how they interact with the technology that we create. Both women are white and in heterosexual relationships, and this can offer different perspectives, which I'll come on to later. Living with them, they're likely to have pets, and for Western countries, this is more likely to be dogs than cats. How does this vary to our average development teams? Joe and Becky, representing developers and testers, are both younger and, as I said previously, higher educated. Surveying my peers, we live in smaller households, and according to Glassdoor, looking at average salaries for software engineers are higher paid. All of these factors tell us that we're not representative of the average user, and if that's the case, then they're likely to make assumptions about their systems. These assumptions get implemented. When I hear that quality is a whole team responsibility, what I think this starts with is calling out those assumptions. In my opinion, assumptions are problematic when they are made by people who can't share the same perspective of their users, and it stops people from being able to interact with the software that we're creating. Some of these assumptions are going to be in your test plan. So it might be that your application is available in a particular language to people of a particular nationality. I've included a picture of a book which represents somebody's reading age. If your application is in English and somebody's first language is not English, what does that mean for the usability of the application? In our test plan, we're really used to defining the operating system, the devices, and the browsers that people might use. But what about the Zoom level? And how does that look? As our average Jessica and Sarah are older and they're more likely to be using things at a higher Zoom level, what does that mean? Especially if we've got automation which looks for particular elements on the page, is that still true? I personally use everything in light mode. I have great difficulty understanding things in dark mode, and typically the developers I work with have everything in dark mode. So when I come to test it, I'm seeing things from a different perspective to them. And finally, this image here I've got representing a user manual. So there might be a difference between what's represented in the user manual, the print screens that I'm following, or the guide that you have available to the users, and the reality. These assumptions get created when you've got day-to-day context. You're working with an application all the time. You know how it works, but the users don't have the same knowledge. Relating to specific operating systems of browsers, Apple's always done a good job of storing passwords, but that was never true until I think it was December last year that DuckDuckGo did not have a password manager. In my test plan, I'm not assuming how somebody is storing their password. I might make an assumption that the password only lasts so long, or somebody's logged in state is only granted for a particular amount of time, but it's knowledge of how somebody is going to start interacting with the system isn't going to get represented there. We have got people from home who need admitting. That worked? Cool. There are lots and lots of assumptions that get made that aren't in your test plan. So I'm going to start with age. You are more likely to have higher technology literacy. All of this room was able to get here today, a location unknown to myself, presumably using some sort of Google Maps, Apple Maps, or otherwise. I used the example earlier of my granddad. My granddad can't use self-serve tills. if there is not somebody at a train station able to provide him a physical ticket, he might not know that a journey is available to him. He's not going to be en route checking his Google Maps to see what an alternative is because a particular tube line was shut. Not related to age, but instead gender, women have a smaller hand span. So if you're designing an application and you're assuming that people are going to be right-handed, what is the clickable area on your phone or on your tablet from your thumb? For women, this is a smaller radius than men. I mentioned first language previously and translatability. We've also got your qualification level. So it might be that if you have a high reading age and you're introduced to an acronym once, that's okay at the start of an article or at the start of your user journey. But if English is not your first language, and then you are basically translating in your head, and then you become across the acronym, your understanding might go down. So you might need to be reinforced with that acronym or not use it at all. I've also got skin color. So it might not affect the overall usability, but if you're not able to react to a post or enable something in your own skin color, are you going to continue using that application? Is that going to appeal to you? And I talked about the fact that Sarah and Jessica are likely to be mothers. What happens then to how long they have to perform a particular user journey if they're distracted by the kids or they're on a dog walk? When we're testing these applications, we start our user journey and follow it through. But what happens if that session becomes inactive? Has data been saved during that user journey and kind of come back to it later? Or do I have to start the process again if I want to? Because people in the technology industry are typically higher paid, it generally means we have a higher disposable income. So we can afford unnecessary is not the right word, but systems like Disney Plus, Netflix, whatever it is. As a development team or as a marketing team, we might decide that a particular pricing structure makes sense, but put that in the hands of users and they might think it's unaffordable. I've talked about glasses and zoom level. And yeah, I also want to just talk about screen time in general. Is somebody likely to be using this application during the day, on their commute, as internet drops out, at nighttime? How does it look in different settings with glare, for example? We've already seen that development teams are not representative of average users, and none of these assumptions are bad. But my job as a tester, I want to call them out and ask questions and talk about what impact that's having. And by calling out that assumption, maybe we can think of a different case. It's not an error case, it's not a negative path, but just think of another way that the system might get used and unearth a bug before it becomes one. And I don't think you can do a slide in 2025 and not talk about AI. These images I'm using on the slide to represent Sarah, Jessica, and Joe, my average developer, are AI created. AI has its own biases. We might know about that as a test team, but if our user is presented with something that is AI created, do they? It's a stop clicking. Okay. So we're going to look at this from my point of view. And for those that know me, this is a joke. I have a condition called aphantasia. It's not able to be medically diagnosed. It's how images work in my head, or rather, they don't. Aphantasia isn't an ability not to fantasize. It's an inability to create those images in your mind's eye. So when I ask you to imagine a tree, there are lots of ways you can imagine a tree. You can imagine a tree at different stages of growth. You could imagine a different species of tree. You could imagine a tree in a different season of life. You could imagine a tree in a different setting, things like that. You might imagine a tree that's swaying in the wind. My inability to form that mental image in my mind allows me to more easily ask questions about what you're imagining. I don't think I'm making as many assumptions as others that I work with. So to give more detail to aphantasia, because it is a strange thing to wrap your head around, if I ask you to take a minute to look at this man, if I move on to the next slide, what would you see? Can you create this image in your mind? This is what I see. Basically, metadata. I'm not able to recall every detail about the image, but I'll basically hold facts in my mind about the image that I've seen. Aphantasia is measured on a 5-point scale. It's not a medical condition that can be diagnosed. You're not going to be able to spot it in a brain scanner, things like that. At the bottom of the scale, this is where I am. This is what I see when I'm thinking of that man in a suit. It moves up towards colors and blurry images. Maybe you're able to call out specific details. Maybe you're able to recognize the image if you see it again. And as you move towards one, you're able to exactly, using a photographic memory, create that image again. The reason I need the number 1 on this slide is because I don't know when that image has finished loading in. I'm not able to recall all of those details. So, developing a plan. We've already determined that you and I are likely not to be our average customers. And we've talked about the common assumptions that you might make in your test plan or otherwise. I've told you that I'm calling out these assumptions because I have aphantasia. So let's have a look at how this works for me. Imagine a game of telephone. A product owner tells a designer, tells the development teams their particular requirements. They share a lot of information. Every single one of those conversations is a place where assumptions can get made. This is way before we've written down specific acceptance criteria or perhaps come up with test cases. A game of sharing information and a game of passing on your perspective of that problem means it's really difficult to retain that customer focus because it's not yours. You are not likely to be aware of the assumptions that you're making as you pass on those requirements. So if you Google shift left testing, it says that this is an approach that software development teams can follow to emphasize moving testing activities earlier in the development process for an improved software quality. And using this approach, you can start testing as soon as the requirements for any software come about. Looking at these requirements, they can get implemented in lots of different ways. And none of those approaches are likely to be inherently wrong. But you have made assumptions about how this would look. So using the example of a language learning app, what is the first thing it asks you? It's likely to ask you, what language do you want to learn? So looking at these 3 implementations, only one of them asks your starting language. When I downloaded these language learning apps, I did it from the UK Play Store. My operating system language on my phone is English, but that might not be my first language. If I change my operating system language on my phone, these 3 apps still appeared in this way. So if English is not my first language, how is this perceived to you? And zooming in on that word perceived, we can use accessibility pillars to help us highlight assumptions. And one of those is that something is perceivable. How do you know that the requirement from a previous screen has been implemented in these slides? All 3 of them have got prompts to ask you what language you'd like to learn, but they're done in different ways. In the middle example, the character and the Duolingo example are both of these asking you the prompt. It has a different look and feel, but it should have the same understanding. So that's our second accessibility criteria. Firstly, that something is perceivable, and secondly, that something is understandable. Going back to the example of women with smaller handspans, I would like to make the assumption that all of these boxes here are the whole clickable area. And this is our third accessibility criteria, that something is operable. Each implementation has assumed a different flag shape. And I'm not saying that your acceptance criteria should go into every specific detail, because if I jump back to the previous slide, it talks about just having the flag of the country where the language is spoken. Spanish, as an example, is spoken in lots of countries. One of those is Spain. But you could have different implementations of this. So for example, the American flag for English on that middle example. Okay. Sorry. So yeah, moving through our language learning apps, the next slide is, why do you want to learn that language? Here, I want to talk about the accessibility pillar, which talks about something being robust. On this example, you can choose as many motivations as you like to learn a language. On the first implementation, it literally says, select as many motivations as you'd like. This is going to be understandable. It's very obvious. You can hold on this screen or press the back button to move to the next one. On the middle, it's the same question. But as soon as you select one, that call to action, the next button appears. I've made an assumption that the user would know they can select more than one, because I'm a tester. I've clicked all of them and all of them become available. But does the user know that? So think back to our assumptions, that somebody's tech savvy, somebody knows that these whole middle tiles are the clickable area. And especially in this final example, which is the Duolingo example, as soon as you select one, the continue button becomes available. I know they're multi-select, they've got square outputs, but yeah, the user might not. Interesting. So all of that to say, you and I are likely not the average user. You can rock up to requirements or sprint planning or whatever your organizations call these sorts of planning meetings and wear a blindfold. You can cover your eyes and ask somebody to describe it to you. You can make your own mock-ups and channel that inability to visualize. But really think about who you want your users to be and how they know the information, because obviously they're not going to be able to see your Jira card, your DevOps card, whatever it is. User acceptance testing is a fantastic opportunity to observe users' behaviors and ask people which parts of the service are important to them. So thinking back to our password manager example, you might notice that the Apple password manager or the DuckDuckGo password manager have different implementations. Then we can also use the accessibility pillars to ensure that each user interface that a user is presented with, sorry, I've said that wrong. You can use the accessibility pillars to go through each user interface and make sure that the information you want to convey is understandable, operable, robust, and perceivable. Understanding your customer goes beyond empathy, involves recognizing and challenging your own assumptions and that of the development teams as well. A way that I really like to do this is by highlighting the difference between me and my developers, because that is a really safe way for me to say that not everyone shares their perspective. That's it.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie, for a really interesting talk, which I think we'll all find very useful. We get back to the office and have to start thinking about our customers. Has anybody got any questions they'd like to ask Emily? Okay, yeah, we've got lots of questions here.
Hi.
Yeah, can I ask about the Aphantasia? Does that apply to things like, for example, diagrams, flow charts, technical, or just visual photographic type things?
And you see it with your eyes closed.
Right.
That's the best summary I can give.
Right.
I'm just visually blind in that sense. I do retain a lot of metadata and information, But I think that in itself is a useful tool because I'm able to think about what I've forgotten. And if I can repeat it back to you, but I've not got the same mental model, it does highlight those gaps. So yeah.
One question up here.
You mentioned shifting left in terms of testing and working with others, but we haven't talked about data. Do you have any recommendations for anyone on getting data to prevent the assumptions?
In my current role, I'm a consultant, so I didn't want to make this specific to a particular project. I use the fact that I can't be an expert in lots of different industries to just ask those stupid questions as it is. I think acknowledging that I don't have the context of the data and just, I start there as a personal approach. But I guess that is in your requirements to some extent, that you're gonna get something back from an API or you're expecting that 200 status. It's just the same what happens when I've not got those things. I think like if you imagine a database schema, that's a really nice way to draw it out. I'm expecting a string. Is it of a particular, either or a table or whatever? I'm expecting a number. Well, which numbers make sense in those things? But no, nothing too particular because I want this to be applicable to context. So
Thank you.
Thank you. Simon, one more
Yeah,
question?
I'll make it quick. Thank you, Emily. Awesome talk. Could you give me an example of where you or one of your team members have seen something happen? You had an assumption that a user would behave in this way and they behaved in a completely unexpected way. How could you share that example and like what was the experience like?
have you ever tried to log on to your online bank and it asks you what's the 5th character of your password and the 8th character of your password? What I do is I press the home button and I go to my password manager and I look at all the different things. And then I come back to my online bank and start the whole process again. Who tests this? I understand that you want it to be secure, but you told me not to write down my password. I'm forced to write down my password because you want me to log in with these silly passwords. Sorry.